Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. In the heart of Salaka, a modest town dusted in the red sands of history and cradled by two gentle hills, there lived a young woman whose dreams were stitched with every fold of fabric she sewed. Lauren was the town's seamstress, not by inheritance, but by necessity and grit. Her days began with the sun, needle in hand, cloth draped across her lap, and a mind filled with quiet hope. She wasn't raised with luxury or the false comfort of privilege. Instead, she was shaped by the calloused palms of her grandmother, a woman who taught her that hands were meant for work and hearts for courage. Lauren's tiny shop stood on the edge of Bacco Market, nestled between an aging bookstall and a vegetable shed. Her prices were modest, but her craft was unmatched. Every hem, every pleat bore the weight of diligence. Yet beneath the swaying folds of Ankara and lace, there lingered something softer, love. Her heart belonged to a man who had mastered the art of dreaming with his eyes wide open. Christopher, a man of tall ambition and short means, wandered into her world with the charm of a storyteller and the hunger of a man not yet shaped by success. He didn't come offering riches, only promises. Not gold but vision. And in a world that often asked Lauren to shrink herself, Christopher made her feel expansive. He talked of logistics routes like poetry, of business expansion like lullabies, and of shared futures like prayer. She listened, absorbed, and believed. Their love wasn't loud. It didn't dance at festivals or declare itself in public squares. It bloomed in the quiet, the way he walked her home after long market days, the notes he left beside her sewing machine, the plans he whispered beneath moonlit skies. There was a tenderness in how they built their bond, like two architects drawing on invisible blueprints. Christopher didn't have wealth, but he carried conviction like a compass, always pointing to some north neither of them had ever seen but both believed existed. He often spoke of building an empire from dust, of challenging the giants in transportation who forgot the little towns like Salaka, of creating something that would outlive their names. And Lauren, with threads still tangled in her fingers and tired eyes from late-night stitching, believed him. Not because she was naive, but because her soul recognized sincerity, or so she thought. One particular evening, as the rain tapped gently on the tin roof of her shop, Christopher entered with a folder that seemed to pulse with promise. He placed it gently before her, as though unveiling a treasure, and opened to reveal a business plan, pages of calculations, projected growth, branding strategies, even a sample logo with bold letters reading, Salaka Swift Movers. He explained each detail with fervor, as though the words were oxygen and she was the only one who could keep him breathing. Lauren listened, nodded, and smiled, not just with her lips but with her entire being. She saw not just a company, but their life taking shape. When Christopher mentioned he needed funding to bring his vision to life, Lauren didn't pause. She didn't ask for a contract or legal assurance. She gave. From the very fabric of her being, she gave. She began by selling her grandmother's last piece of farmland, a modest patch of earth that had once grown yams and cassava, and which held the scent of home in every clump of soil. Next went the heirloom earrings her mother had worn on her wedding day, pure gold passed down through 3 generations, now sold to a jeweler from the next town. But the most painful sacrifice was her tailoring machine, a sturdy face of equipment that had been with her since she first started. It was her lifeline. She kissed its surface before letting it go, whispering a silent prayer that her sacrifice would not be in vain. Friends tried to intervene. They warned her, pleaded with her to wait, to at least ensure she had some form of security. But Lauren's heart had no room for caution. Her love wasn't a transaction, it was an investment. Every coin she handed over, every possession she let go of, was not just for Christopher. It was for the future they had promised each other in hushed tones and quiet evenings. She imagined herself beside him in a spacious office, perhaps typing invoices while he handled operations. She envisioned uniforms with their shared initials, delivery vans branded with the dream they once doodled on paper napkins. Her world was shifting, and she believed it was shifting upwards. The business took off quickly. Salaka Swift Movers, once only an idea scribbled in the margins of Christopher's notebook, was suddenly a name on everyone's lips. Two white-painted trucks rumbled through Salaka's dusty streets, each emblazoned with the bold logo Lauren had first seen on that rainy night. Flyers were posted on community boards, even churches announced their services after Sunday prayers. Christopher became a local star, invited to youth events to speak on entrepreneurship and vision. Lauren watched with pride from the back rows. She didn't need credit, seeing him win was enough. At least it was for a while. As the company grew, so did the space between them. The calls she once received before sunrise now came rarely, and when they did, they were curt and filled with excuses. Busy day, clients to meet, we'll talk later. The warmth in his tone faded like old fabric. She tried to understand. After all, success came with responsibilities. But it wasn't just time he withdrew, it was presence. He stopped showing up at her shop altogether. Their lunch meetings vanished. One evening when she decided to surprise him at his new office, she found herself waiting outside for 3 hours. His secretary, a new girl from town, told her he was unavailable. She stood in silence, holding a food flask that had gone cold, eyes staring into a window. She was no longer allowed to enter. Still, Lauren refused to doubt him. She told herself it was the price of ambition. That soon he would remember, that their love, though paused, was not erased. But in the days to come, Lauren would learn that dreams, when shared with the wrong heart, could become nightmares in disguise. The silence that followed her disappearance wasn't just the absence of footsteps on the familiar red dust streets of Salaka. It was a vacuum that swallowed rumors, twisted facts, and made people fill the gaps with their imaginations. Some said she had gone mad and wandered into the forest beyond Duma's Hill. Others swore they saw her boarding a lorry to the east with nothing but a polythene bag in hand. A few whispered that perhaps the betrayal had been too much and she had taken her life. But none of these voices had ever truly known Lauren. They had seen a soft-spoken girl with kind eyes and assumed fragility, not realizing that the quietest waters often run deepest. In truth, Lauren had left Salaka with nothing but the clothes on her back and a quiet fury that burned behind her gaze. She made her way to Kishira City, a place teeming with chaos, where no one asked questions about past lives and everyone was trying to rewrite their own story. The city towered over her as if daring her to try. She didn't flinch. In Kishira, Lauren started at the very bottom, sweeping floors in office buildings long after everyone had left, mopping corridors that echoed with the voices of people who never saw her. But every night, she would stay a little longer, eyes fixed on charts and whiteboards left behind in meeting rooms, quietly absorbing the language of commerce she had once sacrificed everything for. By the time she secured a job as a receptionist at Eaglelink Freight, she already knew more about logistics than some of the staff with polished shoes and clean fingernails. She kept to herself, took notes no one asked her to take, and watched operations flow like veins through the body of the business. Her ability to listen and learn became her greatest weapon. The managers began to notice her. At first, it was the small things, her accuracy, her punctuality, the way she never needed to be told anything twice. Then came the larger things, how she corrected a routing mistake that could have lost them a major client, how she mediated a conflict between two drivers in a language only they spoke. Slowly, she rose. Not because she begged for opportunities, but because she made herself impossible to ignore. Within 3 years, Lauren was promoted to assistant manager. She was no longer the girl from Salaka who sold her past for someone else's future. She was now the woman companies trusted to solve crises. When her director handed her the file marked Salaka Swift Movers Acquisition Potential, something deep inside her stilled. The name didn't jolt her. It didn't cause her hands to tremble. It simply confirmed that the world had finally come full circle. She stared at the company's logo, the same one she had once seen as a sketch in a dimly lit shop, and made a silent promise to herself. Not revenge, not retaliation, but resolution. She would return, not as a girl scorned, but as a woman transformed. Returning to Salaka wasn't something Lauren did with grand fanfare. She didn't alert the press or inform the local council. She arrived quietly, stepping out of a black SUV that hummed like dignity in motion, her heels clicking softly on the same soil where she once wept in silence. The town looked the same, stubborn, slow, suspicious. But she had changed in ways that words could not capture. Her skin glowed with confidence, her posture straightened with resolve. The woman who stepped into Salaka now wore her pain like armor and her wisdom like perfume. When she entered the small but tidy office of Salaka Swift Movers, the receptionist Madison froze. The pen in her hand clattered to the floor. The name tag on her chest suddenly felt heavier. Christopher wasn't in the front lobby. He was in the back office, unaware that the ghost of his past had just walked through the door in broad daylight. Lauren didn't smirk, she didn't sneer. She simply adjusted her blazer, nodded at Madison without malice, and walked straight to the desk to announce her presence. "I'm here for the transition meeting," she said calmly, placing her Eagle Link credentials on the table like a seal of fate. When Christopher appeared moments later, the color drained from his face. For a moment, the man who once stood so tall beside her now seemed smaller, like ambition had shrunk under the weight of guilt. "Lauren," he croaked, unsure whether to hug her or beg for forgiveness. "Good morning," she replied, extending a professional handshake. "Shall we begin?" The meeting room was quiet save for the soft shuffle of documents and the occasional cough of tension. Lauren led the conversation with the grace of a seasoned executive, laying out terms and expectations without once glancing at the man who had once vowed to build an empire with her. Christopher tried to speak twice, but both times she continued, never giving him the silence he needed to say what no longer mattered. Madison remained in the lobby, frozen behind her desk, fingers pressed against her lips like a prayer she couldn't finish. Lauren never looked back. She didn't need to. Everything she wanted to say was already reflected in her composure, in her competence, in the fact that she was now seated on the other side of the table. And when the meeting ended, when all signatures were finally in place and Salaka Swift Movers was absorbed into Eagle Link's empire, Lauren stood slowly, collected her documents, and turned to Christopher for the first time since she'd walked in. "I hope this transition helps you rest," she said softly, her voice like silk on stone. "Some lessons take years to learn." Then she left, no tears, no glances, no regrets. Only silence followed her, broken only by the soft exhale of a town that had just witnessed the quiet return of royalty. The days that followed Lauren's quiet acquisition of Salaka Swift Movers were not loud or celebratory. There were no parties thrown in her name, no songs composed to honor her return. But the silence carried its own kind of weight, one filled with murmurs of respect and admiration whispered in corners, behind woven baskets at the market, and over boiling pots in family courtyards. Young girls pointed at her from a distance, their eyes wide with wonder. Older women clasped their hands over their hearts when she passed. The same mouths that once pitied her now recounted her story as a lesson, a symbol of what dignity looked like when wrapped in success. Lauren did not bask in it. She walked through town like a shadow that had learned to shine, present, commanding, and unapologetically graceful. She didn't stay at her old house or visit familiar corners that once brought her comfort. Instead, she checked into a quiet lodge just outside Salaka's town square, a place with large windows and tall trees that swayed like old friends who knew how far she had come. Every evening she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunset spill across the earth like a slow blessing. She didn't dwell on Christopher. She didn't revisit the betrayal like an open wound. Her silence was not born of bitterness. It was the peace of someone who had survived a fire and no longer feared the smoke. Though she never spoke of her pain, those who had wronged her felt its presence in ways they could not name. Madison walked with her shoulders lower now, the confident sway she once carried reduced to stiff movements and half smiles. She avoided Lauren at all costs, yet there were moments, brief but potent, when their eyes met across the room or through glass windows. And in those moments, Lauren did not blink. She held her gaze steady, not in challenge but in quiet authority. It was Christopher who eventually broke the invisible silence. He arrived at her lodge one afternoon, his clothes neat but his eyes sunken, voice trembling with years of guilt that had aged him faster than time. Lauren answered the door without surprise, as if she had always known this day would come. He stood there not with the arrogance of the man who once made promises beneath starlight, but with the uncertainty of someone who had finally realized the value of what he discarded. His words stumbled over themselves as he tried to explain, to confess, to apologize. "I didn't know what I had," he admitted, voice cracking like glass under strain. "I thought I was chasing success, but every step I took away from you was a descent." Lauren listened, arms folded gently across her chest. Her expression never softened, nor did it harden. She simply waited, allowing him the space to spill his regrets onto the floor between them like broken pearls from a snapped necklace. When he finally fell silent, she looked at him not with anger, but with a gaze so steady it felt like a mirror. She didn't offer him forgiveness, nor did she seek revenge. Instead, she offered him something far more terrifying: truth. "You didn't ruin me," she said softly. "You refined me." Her words settled over the room like a final chapter closing, heavy and absolute. Christopher stood there, unsure whether to feel relieved or condemned. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came. Lauren stepped back and closed the door gently, leaving him to stand outside, alone with the echo of everything he had lost. That night she slept deeply, her dreams unbothered by ghosts or old wounds. She woke with the certainty that she had done what few ever manage. She had returned not to reclaim the past, but to prove that healing had no need for applause. Over the next few weeks she finalized the integration between Eagle Link and Salaka Swift Movers. She trained the new team, empowered the local staff, and ensured that the business could stand on its own long after she left. Her presence became a blueprint, not a crutch. And when her work was complete, she packed her suitcase just as quietly as she had arrived. She left behind no souvenirs, no monuments, just memories, rumors, and a legacy of poise that hung in the air like the last note of a song no one wanted to end. Her departure from Salaka was as quiet as her return. She didn't inform anyone, no final meetings, no goodbye speeches. She simply entered the same SUV and left the town that had once been both her cradle and her battlefield. From a distance, it looked as if she had simply vanished again, but those who paid attention understood better. Lauren hadn't disappeared. She had moved forward. Her story, however, remained. It spread beyond Salaka, reaching nearby villages, whispered in classrooms, and retold at firesides. People didn't speak of her as a victim, but as a woman who transformed her pain into power. Mothers taught their daughters to remember Lauren when faced with betrayal. Friends used her name when speaking of strength. Even the town's elders, once skeptical of ambition in women, now nodded in approval when her story was mentioned. Back in the city, Lauren continued to rise. Her name appeared in magazines. She sat on panels, mentored young professionals, and remained grounded. She never erased her past, but she never lived in it either. Christopher and Madison struggled to keep their business afloat under the new structure. Without Lauren's vision, everything felt heavier, slower, uninspired. Their partnership cracked under the pressure, and soon their names faded from the lips of the very town that once celebrated them. But Lauren, she had become something more than a name. She had become a symbol, a quiet storm that passed through with grace and left behind the fertile ground for others to grow. In the years that followed her departure from Salaka, Lauren's name began to drift beyond the borders of memory and into the realm of legend. What had once been a whispered tale of heartbreak transformed into a powerful testament of restoration. In villages far from Salaka, mothers would sit their daughters beneath mango trees and tell them of the girl who gave everything she had for love, only to be left with nothing, and how she turned that nothing into everything. Young women seeking directions saw her as a mirror, a reminder that betrayal could be a doorway, not a dead end. And even among men her name carried weight. They spoke of her not with mockery, but with the uneasy respect reserved for someone who had walked through fire and emerged unburned. Yet Lauren herself never sought out the praise. In boardrooms across the continent, she wore the same calm expression, handled the same high-stakes negotiations, and returned home each day to peace, not the absence of conflict but the presence of self-worth. She didn't dwell on the past because she had mastered the present. Her days were filled with strategy, mentorship, and service. She launched scholarships for girls from small towns who dream bigger than their circumstances. She sponsored logistics training for women who wanted to work in industries long dominated by men. Her success was never just hers, it became a ladder quietly placed for others to climb. Despite all she had achieved, Lauren remained grounded in the simplicity of her upbringing. Her voice was never raised in arrogance, her feet never stepped over others to ascend. She moved through life with the quiet assurance of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, not to herself, not to her past, and certainly not to anyone who once doubted her. She still wrote in a journal every evening, just like she did during those long, quiet nights in Kashira when all she had were memories and determination. Her words no longer bled pain, but purpose. She wrote of balance, of legacy, of letting go without forgetting. On rare occasions, her mind drifted to Christopher and Madison, not out of longing but reflection. She wondered if they ever sat together in the empty office where her dream once lived, if they ever looked at the company logo and remembered whose hands first traced its lines. She didn't wish them harm. She no longer needed the satisfaction of their downfall. Her growth had taken her far beyond vengeance. Her success was not built on their failure, but on her refusal to break. In interviews, when asked what kept her going, she simply said, "I had to believe there was more for me than pain." That belief became her compass, guiding her through every decision, every opportunity, and every new beginning. Christopher's world had grown smaller over time. Without Lauren's guiding hand, the company struggled to maintain relevance. Clients complained about disorganization. Drivers left. Madison, once radiant with pride, now walked with shadows under her eyes. Their marriage, born of secrecy and arrogance, withered under the weight of unspoken guilt and misaligned ambitions. They rarely spoke of Lauren, but she lingered between them like a ghost neither could confront nor forget. Christopher tried to revive the business, but his decisions lacked vision. His charisma, once his greatest tool, had dulled with disappointment. He applied for loans, pitched new strategies, even considered rebranding, but nothing worked. Eventually, Salaka Swift Movers was sold off entirely, absorbed into a faceless chain that stripped it of all identity. Madison moved back to her parents' home in shame, and Christopher remained in the town, a shadow of the man he once pretended to be. He heard her name in every success story coming from Kashira, saw her on magazine covers, and watched her deliver keynote addresses on televised conferences. But the one thing he never received was closure. Lauren had never returned his calls, never sent a letter, never publicly acknowledged what he did. That silence became his sentence. It was not hatred that haunted him. It was the knowledge that he no longer mattered in the life of the woman who once gave him everything. Lauren, meanwhile, continued to build her legacy with grace. She founded her own logistics academy and named it after her grandmother, the woman who first taught her to believe in the strength of her hands. The campus stood at the edge of a city once unfamiliar to her, now home to generations of women who would come to learn, grow, and rewrite their stories. Each brick was a declaration, each classroom a defiance of the odds she once faced. She never married, not because she didn't believe in love, but because she had made peace with her own company. If love came, it would find her whole, not waiting. She wore her singlehood with pride, not as a scar but as a crown. And when people asked if she ever wished things had gone differently with Christopher, she would smile gently and say, "If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have become me." Her journey was not one of perfect paths or easy victories. It was forged through pain, built with sacrifice, and carried by resilience. She had not only survived betrayal, she had transformed it into a platform. And long after she was gone, long after the last person who remembered her name had drawn their final breath, her story would remain, echoing in courtyards, scribbled into school books, and told under stars as the tale of the woman who turned broken pieces into a palace. And that above all else was her triumph. In the quiet lull that followed years of progress, Lauren found herself in a season of stillness, not stagnation, but reflection. Her days moved with purpose, yet she no longer rushed toward anything. Each morning, she walked through the campus she had built, stopping to greet students with eyes full of dreams, recognizing in them the same hunger she once held during long nights in unfamiliar cities. The girls came from every corner, some timid, some bold, many broken. But under her leadership, they began to reshape their own stories. Lauren didn't see herself as a savior. She saw herself as a witness to what belief could do. She taught them not just about logistics or operations, but about worth, the kind that doesn't vanish when love fails or dreams are delayed. Every lesson carried fragments of her journey, though she never named names. The wisdom was wrapped in parables, the pain coded in metaphors. To the students, she was a mystery, graceful, composed, but deeply human. They wondered what she had endured to become this version of herself, but they respected the boundaries she kept around her past. She allowed them to learn from her strength, not from her scars. Her office was filled with letters from former students, some now managing regional hubs, others launching ventures of their own. They thanked her not just for the skills, but for the belief. "You saw us before we saw ourselves," one letter read, its handwriting shaky but sincere. She kept them all tucked into a drawer lined with silk as reminders of what her pain had produced. Once, on an early winter evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed orange, Lauren received a letter unlike any other. It was hand-delivered, sealed with a faded wax emblem she hadn't seen in years. The handwriting struck her instantly, firm yet familiar, like a voice she thought she'd forgotten. She opened it slowly, her fingers steady, heart unshaken. It was from Madison, the woman who once stood beside her as a sister, who later stood across from her in betrayal. The letter wasn't long. Madison wrote of regret, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a confession she could no longer carry. She spoke of years spent drowning in what-ifs, of sleepless nights haunted by choices she couldn't reverse. "I was blinded by the illusion of having won," she wrote, "but I lost the one person who ever truly loved me like family." Lauren read it twice, then folded it neatly and returned it to its envelope. She didn't cry, she didn't call. She simply placed it in the same drawer where her students' letters lived. Not because she considered them equal, but because they all belonged to the same story, the story of how she became herself. That night, she sat by her window and watched the city lights flicker below. The world was so vast, and her journey had taken her far from that dusty market town, yet every milestone still carried the echo of where she started. She closed her eyes and whispered a single word into the night air: peace. Though she had no children of her own, Lauren had birthed a legacy. Her name appeared on foundations, awards, and international boards. Yet she remained a figure of humility. She rejected grand titles, preferring to be called Auntie Lauren by her students and staff. She ate with them during breaks, walked with them across campus, listened to their fears without judgment. Her presence calmed storms. People from distant cities traveled just to see her speak, hoping to capture some of the quiet fire she carried. She never boasted, never posted pictures of her accomplishments. In fact, she rarely gave interviews anymore. When pressed by reporters for quotes or public addresses, she'd respond with a gentle smile and say, "The work speaks," and it did. Under her guidance, young women who had once doubted their own worth now led teams, owned businesses, and spoke boldly in rooms where they were once invisible. Her leadership was not loud. It was layered, like music written in a language only the soul could hear. Every decision she made was rooted in values, not vanity. When partnerships arose that didn't align with her mission, she turned them down without hesitation. People called her difficult at times, but those who understood called her principled. And for Lauren, that distinction mattered. She had walked through betrayal, built from ruins, and emerged with a heart too full to settle for anything less than alignment. Her clarity made her a force in rooms where people were used to confusion and compromise. And though she walked softly, her steps reshaped the path for those who came after. A decade passed and the world continued to shift, but Lauren's fire never dimmed. Her work expanded across nations, her programs translated into new languages, her students becoming mentors themselves. The girl who once sewed fabric beneath a leaking roof had now sewn her name into history, not for fame, but for meaning. Yet one evening, during a gala held in her honor, a young woman asked her a question that made the room fall still. What would you tell the version of yourself that once loved the wrong person? The hall was quiet, cameras clicked, faces turned. Lauren paused, her fingers curled loosely around a wine glass she hadn't sipped. Then she spoke. I would tell her thank you. The audience waited confused. She continued, because that girl loved deeply, gave freely and believed completely. And though she was betrayed, she didn't let bitterness rewrite her heart. She kept loving, she just learned to love herself more. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was reverent, slow, building, heartfelt, because everyone in that room had, in some way, loved the wrong person, trusted the wrong voice, or gambled their worth on someone who wasn't ready. And in Lauren's words, they found grace not for the ones who hurt them, but for themselves. That night, she returned home and looked at herself in the mirror, not as a survivor, not as a warrior, but as a woman who had finally made peace with every chapter of her story. Her eyes no longer searched for meaning in old wounds. They now glowed with the light of someone who had found wholeness, not by erasing the pain, but by honoring the way it shaped her. The final years of Lauren's life were lived not in retirement or retreat, but in intentional stillness. She no longer chased after milestones or measured herself by titles or timelines. Her joy was found in small things: the laughter of young women on campus, the way the jacaranda trees swayed outside her office window, the warm calls from former mentees now living abroad. She had created a life that needed no validation, a legacy that required no monuments. Her mornings began with meditation and tea, her afternoons with handwritten letters to women running her programs across the continent. She preferred pens over keyboards, the feel of paper under her fingers a comforting contrast to the digital noise of the world. When she wasn't working, she visited local orphanages, where she read to children stories she had once written in private notebooks, tales of girls who didn't have shoes but learned how to fly, of women who lost everything only to discover they were everything they needed. She lived alone, not from loneliness, but because her solitude had become a sanctuary. Her home was quiet, filled with art, books, and soft music. No visitors arrived unannounced, and no chaos crossed her threshold. Peace wasn't something she stumbled into. It was something she had built, brick by brick, after years of carrying rubble. Occasionally, reporters still requested interviews, hoping to capture the final reflections of a woman whose story had inspired millions. She turned most of them down, though once every few years she would grant a quiet conversation to a young journalist who reminded her of herself. In those interviews, she never centered herself. She spoke of systems, of barriers, of how important it was to be both resilient and supported. She emphasized that while her story was unique, it wasn't special. There are thousands of Laurens walking through fire right now, she once told a reporter. The difference is some get to tell their story. Most never do. That humility made her impossible to forget. And though she was celebrated globally, she remained committed to lifting others higher than she had ever climbed. She created fellowships that prioritized voices often silenced, funded research by rural girls who were told science was not for them, and championed laws that protected women in vulnerable professions. When asked what still motivated her, she answered without hesitation, I remember what it felt like to be voiceless. That memory, though decades old, stayed close. It shaped her choices, her compassion, and the tireless way she made room at every table she sat at. She had no interest in being the only one elevated. Her power was in multiplying opportunities, in pulling others up until the room no longer needed a hero. On her 72nd birthday, Lauren hosted a private dinner, not a lavish gala, but a heartfelt gathering of 25 women whose lives had been changed by her presence. Some were CEOs, others were single mothers running small shops. A few were still students. They came from different paths, spoke different dialects, but every single one of them credited her for believing in them when the world didn't. The night was filled with stories not of her, but because of her. One woman shared how Lauren's scholarship saved her from an arranged marriage. Another told of how she read Lauren's story during a suicidal moment and found the will to keep going. A third revealed how her entire village now sends girls to school because of a speech Lauren once gave beneath a tree during a power outage. Lauren sat quietly as they spoke, her eyes glistening not from pride, but gratitude. She didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. She received their words as one receives blessings humbly, reverently. At the end of the night, she stood and raised a glass. "Thank you," she said, "not just for honoring me tonight, but for reminding me why I survived." The room fell into a silence that felt sacred. No one cheered, no one clapped. They simply absorbed her presence, knowing they were witnessing not just a woman, but a story, one that would outlive them all. When Lauren passed away quietly in her sleep 3 years later, the news spread like a gentle wave. There were no public breakdowns, no exaggerated mourning. Instead, there was reflection. Across the continent, women lit candles. Girls shared excerpts of her speeches on social media. Schools held assemblies in her honor. Communities painted murals of her smiling beneath jacaranda trees. And in Salaka, the town that once pitied her, a statue was erected, not because she needed it, but because the people needed to remember. Not her wealth, not her wisdom, but her resilience. The inscription on the base read, "She gave her all, and when it broke her, she built something greater from the pieces." Christopher attended the memorial. Older now, gray at the temples, quieter in posture. He sat in the back and wept, not out of guilt anymore, but reverence. Madison came too, standing far from the crowd, her head bowed, hands clasped. They didn't speak to anyone. They didn't need to. Their presence was not about reconciliation. It was about acknowledgement. And as the sky darkened over Salaka that evening, a soft wind passed through the market, over rooftops, into open windows, carrying with it the name of a woman who turned her sorrow into strength, and whose legacy was not carved in stone, but etched into the hearts of every soul she touched. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.